Welcome back to Micro-Digressions. This is Spencer Case, and I'm pleased to have Matthew Adelstein on the podcast again. How are you doing, Matthew?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
So you've ranted a couple of times, but this is the first full episode we've done together, and I'm very glad to do it. Very glad to do it. And for those of you who don't know, Matthew is the boy genius who runs the Bentham's Bulldog Substack. If you don't know about it, you're in for a treat. Lots of very interesting stuff about utilitarianism, arguments for the existence of God, commentary, which he puts out at just like an unbelievable rate. I don't know how you do it, man. I thought I was prolific before I had kids, but not this prolific. So great to have you. And we are going to be talking about arguments for the existence of God. I've had so many technical problems with this episode. I wonder if Satan knows about this and he's trying to stop us from recording this podcast.
Yeah, or maybe God, as opposed to this one where we're talking more about the arguments that don't work.
That's true. That's true. Although I assume God would not want people to accept bad arguments for his existence, especially if there are better arguments available. So yeah, you've got this tier list, this ranking of arguments for the existence of God, and I like just rankings. Just in general, I think they're great, whether it's like best movies or best Miles Davis albums or what have you. So I think it's fun. And we're just going to start at the bottom of the list and just go all the way up as far as we can go. And I think we'll probably have at least one more episode to talk about the really good arguments.
Thanks for the kind words. I appreciate it. And nice to be here.
So, I should probably make an announcement that my second child was just born 10 days ago, Nathan J. Case, and I was in the room for the delivery. So that was a pretty remarkable experience. I'm very glad to, Eli has a little brother now, and it's sort of, it's exciting and a little bit nerve-wracking at the same time, as you might imagine. But I had this thought. I almost made a Facebook post about it, but I didn't. But I still might. And it was something like, have you heard people say I saw my kid be born and now I believe in God or something like that? People have these spiritual epiphanies. I didn't have an epiphany like that, but I can see how somebody could have one. And it's not like it would be an argument. Premise one, babies. Premise two, blah, 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 blah. God exists. Conclusion. Okay.
The best explanation of babies' cuteness, of their organs all functioning properly. And so
I wasn't even thinking that. I was just thinking there's something about just that experience that could open you up to a sense of wonder and a sense of maybe there's more to the world than I think about my day-to-day life. I can see how that kind of paradigm shift might lead people in a religious direction. Anyway, I thought I would mention that since it's kind of big personal news for me.
Yeah, well, congratulations on the second child.
Thank you. So let's start off with the really, really bad ones. You've got an F tier. Is there anything below the F tier? Anything that you wouldn't even put on? Arguments that are so bad that William Lane Craig won't even use them? Because William Lane Craig seems to think look, philosophers have all these arguments for the existence of God, and they're all great. They're all wonderful.
How I rank them isn't very much a function of how convinced I am of the argument. So the reason I rank some of the arguments F tier that I do is because I think they have negative force, where they actually end up being evidence against the existence of God when you take into account the phenomenon that they're discussing. So I think that's true of the moral argument, for instance, which we'll talk about in a moment, where I think that actually, if they're right that atheism implies moral anti-realism, because I don't think that God is the sort of being who could ground morality, I think that would be very strong evidence against theism. So the more there is in defense of the premise of the moral argument that atheism implies nihilism, the less likely theism is. So that was sort of the arguments that were in F tier, where the arguments that basically I think just have no force or have negative force. But there are some arguments that, while they technically have some force, I think are really bad arguments, in that I'm pretty sure that the phenomenon that they appeal to is false. But yeah, so I guess the long answer is there are some arguments that I think the typical proponent expounding them is sort of like more mistaken than the people who expound, say, the moral argument. But I think I don't think there are any arguments that are below the ones in F tier, because even though some of the arguments are like obviously wrong, at least they don't end up being evidence against theism.
Okay, you might as well say, and what have you got in, just briefly, what have you got in the C, B, A, and S tiers? Because you have those various tiers. Just say briefly what you've got in the other tiers.
Like, you want me to list the arguments in each tier?
No, I just mean what features do they have that make them deserve to be in each of those?
Oh, so F is arguments with 0 or negative force. D is arguments with very little force, where I'm quite confident that they're wrong and don't mean much. C is arguments that are like a little bit of a chip in favor of theism. B is arguments that I think, are kind of like, they're sort of like decently strong evidence. There's something theism better explains. A is the arguments that are really good. And S is the arguments that are like, the very, very top, where it's some phenomenon that's like really, really strong evidence for theism. So that's the ranking.
I see. So the worst argument I've ever heard anyone give for the existence of God, I think, is like worse than any of the things on your F tier. It doesn't give any evidence against God's existence. It's just profoundly unpersuasive. So I met some Mormon missionaries on campus when I was an undergrad, a few years after I left the Mormon church. And they asked me, do you believe in God? And they usually expect people to say yes and sort of proceed from there to like, okay, what about Christianity? Okay, now here's a message about Jesus Christ. If you say you don't believe in God, they really don't know what to say. And so one of them says, well, can I try to convince you with an argument? I said, sure, I'm all ears. He says, well, if God doesn't exist, then I'm wasting my time. But I really feel like I'm not wasting my time. It was like, yeah, I think that first premise looks pretty good, but the second one's a real doozy. Anyone who's not already a theist is probably not going to be moved by that. So I think that is actually worse than any argument I've heard on your F tier.
Yeah, I guess one that I've heard that's similarly bad comes from the mind of the brain genius Ray Comfort. And he argues that God is the best explanation of bananas, that bananas function very similarly to human artifacts, and that, they sort of fit in our hands, and they have this, top that you can take off, and they have this protective skin. Now, this is silly for a lot of reasons, one of which is that modern bananas are the byproduct of selection from farmers who bred bananas with more and more fruit. So there is a designer of bananas. It's like, if you look at natural bananas, they're very different, and they're much weirder than the modern bananas that we eat.
I thought that was a spoof, though. I didn't think he was serious.
I think he was, but I could be wrong.
Okay, I hope not. That's pretty terrible. All right, so let's start with the F tier. So down in the F tier, you've got, let's see. Why don't we start with actually, there's this Mereological one that I hadn't heard before. Sorry, the Neoplatonic proof, you give it a D-, but I think it should be F.
Yeah.
I think that
maybe
that's really bad. Why don't we start with that one, actually?
Okay, sounds good. So the Neoplatonic proof, basically the idea is, it's a traditional kind of cosmological argument, and it says that there are things of a particular type where they require explanations. Uh-huh. Now, what the thing that it says needs explanations is that if you have different parts that bind together, then you need some explanation for the parts sort of forming a composite object. So the idea is that anything that's composite, it needs some explanation for why the parts form an object. And so by regress, then you have to get something absolutely simple. And then they try to argue that that thing is God. So I think this argument is very bad. I don't know. I mean, first of all, I think it's just false on every view of composition. So there are different views of what it takes for some things to form a composite object. One of the views is called Mereological universalism. What Mereological universalism says is just any collection of stuff forms its own object. So there's an object composed of me, your left ear, and the Eiffel Tower. Just a combination of stuff forms a composite object. Well, if Mereological universalism is true, then you don't need anything to form a composite object. Another view is called Mereological nihilism, where the Mereological nihilists say that composite objects don't really exist, that really all there is non-composite objects. And so chairs, they don't really exist, just they're a collection of atoms arranged like a chair, which we call a chair. Well, on this view, there aren't any composite objects, so it's not a problem. There's other views called mereological restrictivism, which say that mereology occurs only under some conditions. But on these views, like the mereological restrictivists generally will not think you need some external sustaining cause to bind the parts together, and it's just not at all clear why anyone would think that, right? So imagine that the first object was, I don't know, like involved a chair. Well, why would you need some cause? Like, what would the cause need to do? Like, it seems like if the particles are arranged in the right way, there would just be a chair. Okay, so it's not exactly clear why you would need some external source that binds it together. And then lastly, I don't think that there's any viable way of getting from an absolutely simple source that it doesn't have any parts to establishing that thing has to be God. I think there could be a particle with various properties that produces things after it. So I think this argument is not at all good.
Yeah, I mean, it has that in common with other cosmological arguments. Not all of them. In fact, I think none of them actually try to prove all of the properties of God or something like that. Just a being that's got one important quality of God, like being a first mover or something like that. And then you have an abduction or an inference to the best explanation that thing would be God.
Well, often people will try to get all the divine properties. So they'll, like the Thomists will very often, they'll have this argument and they'll say, well, it's absolutely simple. And then they'll argue for various bits of Thomistic metaphysics. They'll say, if it's simple, then it can't have any parts. So there can't even be a distinction between its essence and its existence. And so it has to be pure existence. And they'll have all these very contorted steps. And I basically just don't think any of this works. So usually they will try to get all the divine properties from the things that they prove, like there's an unmoved mover or something. But I tend to think these steps are not very successful.
Those are subsequent arguments, though. The initial argument gets you only a little bit in that direction.
Yeah, that's right.
And the other thing about it is just suppose you give this argument to an atheist and they think, okay, there does need to be an external binding agent. They could just adopt mereological nihilism and say, okay, well, I guess no God, I guess we just have, particles arranged chairwise and not actual chairs. Like, why is that such a huge concession to have to make? So, yeah, just that one struck me as being particularly bad, even though it was in the D- tier. I think I'd give that an F.
I feel a little bit bad putting arguments very low if there are sort of like some smart people who defend them. So like Ed Feser is a big proponent of this argument, and Feser's not a dumb guy. So it's possible I'm missing something, but I don't think I am. And yeah, I think the argument is supremely terrible.
So let's go back to other things on the F tier. All right, maybe the nomological argument is one we should talk about because it's sort of similar, I think. Why don't we talk about that one?
Sure. So the nomological argument it's the argument from regularities. The idea is that on atheism, it's surprising that there are these universal laws that hold throughout the entire universe. There are vastly more ways that you would have things not hold throughout the entire universe. And so it's surprising that you get these simple patterns. Now, I think that this argument, I ranked it so low because I think it's evidence for atheism. Where on atheism, I think it makes a lot of sense that there are these very simple laws that hold throughout the universe and that simpler states of affairs are more likely to obtain. This is why, no one's that puzzled that a tiger doesn't appear in your room 1 second from now, because, that would be vastly more complicated and involve, new stuff at the fundamental level that there's no reason to believe in. So I don't think there's anything that unlikely about it on atheism. In contrast, I think it's pretty surprising on theism that we have these laws that hold throughout the entire universe, when you would think if there was an agent who was aiming for specific goals, there would be lots of instances where suspending the laws would achieve their goal. So lots of cases where slightly suspending the laws would bring about certain valuable outcomes. So on theism, we'd expect predictable enough laws to enable us to basically make decisions. I think that you would expect that the laws would not be so predictable that they are just completely invariant throughout the entire universe. And so for that reason, I think this is overall evidence for atheism. I'm
not sure I see that last point. Like, what if the clockmaker is good enough that a lot of interventions aren't needed? The goals are going to be realized by the stable framework of creation.
Well, there are inevitably vastly more ways of bringing about outcomes via complicated laws than via simple laws. So let's say that, all of our actions have just huge numbers of ripple effects, if only because delaying when people have sex by just a few seconds completely changes the identity of their future child. So for this reason, the states of affairs that are optimal are very, very highly specific. So it's surprising that God doesn't violate the laws in small ways in order to bring about certain extremely valuable outcomes. God could have, had the laws not be completely invariant so that Hitler's mother, didn't get pregnant, and so then Hitler didn't murder millions of people.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm seeing this as a compelling argument or like evidence for atheism, but I see it. I do think it's not a very good argument, because if you're an atheist, presumably you're some kind of naturalist. You believe in some kind of natural order. Wouldn't that involve some kind of regularity?
I guess I think what they would say there is, well, then if naturalism involves irregularity, well, the thing that's puzzling is that there is irregularity in the first place, rather than just random sort of chaos, because there are vastly more ways to be chaotic than to be simple. But I just think you can give a perfectly good explanation in terms of simplicity.
Sorry, how's that again?
Well, laws that are invariant throughout the entire universe are much simpler. If you want to fully describe everything that happens throughout the universe, it's much easier to write it down if there's just one universal set of laws than if you have to say, oh, these laws hold here, and these laws hold here, and these laws hold here.
I see.
So for that reason, I think universal laws are just going to be simpler.
Right. Okay. So let's get to the moral argument. This one I also think is pretty bad. Why don't you go ahead and explain this one? But I think many philosophers would rank this one as maybe the worst argument for the existence of God.
Yeah, so I think the moral argument is very bad. The way the moral argument goes is it says if there's no God, there are no objective moral values and duties, but there are objective moral values and duties, so God exists. Now, the problem is that, first of all, there's no reason to think that if there's no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties. And there's never been a good argument for that. And most of the arguments that you might give for that would just imply that even if that are just general arguments for moral skepticism. And so if those arguments work, then there isn't a good reason to accept the second premise. The two premises are in tension. I think the bigger problem for the argument is that if you want for the argument to work, it has to be that there would be no morality if there weren't God, but God is the sort of being who's capable of grounding moral facts. And so that's where the moral facts are grounded. But I don't think God is the sort of being that's capable of grounding moral facts. I don't think moral facts can be grounded in an agent. Think about the wrongness of inflicting pain on others. What would it mean for the thing that explains that to be something about an agent, other than the victim in question? That suggestion just strikes me as completely bizarre. The moral Platonist will say, there's a moral fact that pain is bad, and the theist will say, who grounds morality in God's character, will say, it's part of God's character that pain is bad. So in both cases, it's equally explanatorily vicious. But it's just totally unclear what about God's character is supposed to ground morality. How is it that God makes certain moral facts true? And generally they say, well, God's good. But you can't say that God is, if God is good and good is grounded in God, then saying God is good is just saying that God is God. So I don't think that God is sort of capable of grounding morality. I don't think that there's any explanatory advantage there. I think that you need to believe that there's morality outside of God for it to be intelligible to say that God is good and to think that God acts for reasons. So it can't, when you say God is good, it seems like God is acting for reasons. He has reason to do the things that he does. But these reasons can't be grounded in his character, because you don't just want to say that when you say God is good, all you mean is he acts in accordance with his character. Okay, so with all that said, I think that it's false that God is capable of grounding morality. So then I think this argument is an own goal, where if it turns out that the premise is true, that absent God there would be no morality, then this would be very strong evidence against theism, because then that would mean that there's no objective morality. And if there's no objective morality, then theism is almost certainly false, because theism is the idea that God is perfectly morally good. And so if if there's no such thing as perfect moral goodness, then you can't have a being of limitless perfect moral goodness.
I guess I partly agree with you. The part that I agree with is I don't see why you need God for there to be moral truths. Like, I've never seen why that's necessary, and I've nonetheless, this argument seems to be very popular. Like I hear this from theists all the time. Well, what explains the moral truths? Surely something must explain why murder is wrong or something. And they're trying to push you to say, oh yes, there must be an explanation. God has to be that explanation. But I just feel completely unmoved of why, like, the most fundamental moral truths need to be explained by something. I guess the part where maybe I disagree is I do think that there is a difference in plausibility between divine command theory, where God's commands or commandments create what's morally right and wrong, and the view that it's like goodness just is some like God's essence or some part of God's essence or nature or something like that. I suppose if I were a theist, I would find that kind of attractive. Like what would be a more firm foundation for morality than like existence itself or something like that?
It seems very strange for like moral facts to be grounded in a being, where it doesn't make. I find it very hard to make sense of the suggestion that the wrongness of torturing babies is in some way located in a being. Like it just seems to supervene on facts about the babies and what you're doing to them, rather than about some being.
If that being is existence itself or something like that, I don't know.
I find the notion that being is existence itself to be similarly hard to make sense of.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and even if they are existence itself, like I find it equally hard to make sense of. Like at that point, you're just stacking on multiple weird claims. Okay, existence itself is a being, and something about this being makes it wrong to torture people. It just seems like a category error. Like imagine you were like, oh, the wrongness of torturing babies is grounded in some chair. And then you're like, what? That doesn't make any sense. And they say, well, the chair is existence itself. It still sort of seems to be nonsense. I also think that then if you go this route, then you have a problem in explaining God's character. So the way I want to explain God's features is I want to say that God is the feature he does because he has some single property like perfection, or like he has the property of being an unlimited agent. And because he's unlimited, he sort of knows all the moral facts. And then he's motivated to follow them because he grasps the reasons to follow the moral facts. But if you say that God explains morality, then you can't use morality to explain the features that God has for fear of explanatory regress.
I think you can split the horns of the Euthyphro dilemma. Like, are things wrong because God forbids them, or does he forbid them because they're wrong? That does logically leave open the possibility that God, like his nature, constitutes the ultimate standard in some way. It's not a strict logical dichotomy. This is like William Lane Craig's defense of this, which I don't accept, but I think it's interesting enough to be worth talking about. He wants to accept something like moral realism and reject Platonism. So he's like a strict anti-Platonist. He doesn't believe in universals or abstract properties of any kind. But he still wants to be a realist. And so what he says, well, then the ground for the moral standards has to be a particular, because there are no Platonic universals to ground them. And that's how he gets it off the ground, or he tries to.
Yeah, I don't think that there are good objections to Platonism. For the reasons I described, I don't think that God is the sort of being that's capable of grounding morality. I don't think morality can have a source in that sense. If you say that there just is, that God is the good, then you posit strictly more moral facts, because you say God's nature is the same as the good, and God's nature is such that he disapproves of lying and so on, and of murdering. So you'll get strictly more immoral facts. I think that Platonism is independently plausible. So if their argument is against Platonism, then I don't think that'll be plausible. I also think, like, if you're going this route, you'll probably want to go a similar route for other kinds of abstract objects. And I think that gets dicier. So it seems, for instance, that, like, you'd want to ground the laws of logic in God then, in some sense. But then I think then you get an explanatory regress, because it seems like, in some sense, God's existence will depend on the laws of logic. Like, that there is one God, that there is a God, depends on the fact that, that a thing is itself. If a thing was not itself, then the sense that there is just one God couldn't be made intelligible. And so if you're using it to ground logic, then I think you get a regress where you need logic for God to exist, and you need God to exist for logic to exist.
I wonder, do we get similar paradoxes if people ask, well, let's see, what about the moral facts themselves? Is it good that the moral facts exist, or something like that? Could somebody try to say, if there's like some kind of explanatory paradox in the existence of God case, there would be with just moral facts or logical facts or something?
Yeah, maybe you could make a similar claim about logic, where you would say that the laws of logic, where the idea would be that in order to have the law of identity, you need the law of identity. So you get it explaining itself. But I guess I would say that I don't know that the law of identity really, like, explains itself. It's true that the features of the law of identity are such that if you deny the law of identity, you would deny them, right? So then you would deny that the law of identity is identical to itself. But it doesn't seem like there's going to be the same kind of explanatory connection. Well, I guess, maybe there's not in the theism case. Yeah, okay, so maybe this argument doesn't work. Okay.
I do want to point out a feature of this argument that I think is common to a lot of the arguments for existence of God, where when a lot of the time when I'm arguing with theists who are pressing this argument, they start sounding like my atheist error theorist friends. They start like adopting like moral skepticism and moral error theoretic arguments. But the difference is there's this twist at the end where God swoops down in and like saves realism at the end. And I think there are a lot of arguments for the existence of God that are kind of like this. There's sort of like God of the gaps, like in a philosophical way, where there's something that takes some entity that we think exists or that we think exists or something, and then run all the skeptical and error theoretic arguments and then say, oh, but of course, we need to preserve that. And so, God can do that because God is omnipotent. This is like a common feature of a lot of these arguments that I don't find very persuasive.
Yeah, I think that's right. I basically I don't think there's any like clear reason to prefer the theistic account of morality over just being a Platonist. And I think the theistic account is very hard to make sense of. And especially when you try to use it to explain, like it would be weird if only morality was grounded in God. It seems like morality, logic, math, and so on, these will stand or fall together. But it seems even more unintelligible for other abstract objects to be identical to parts of God. Like generally people say that the mathematical objects are thoughts in God's mind. And that just seems completely unintelligible. I'm a dualist, right? So I think that it is impossible for a clump of matter to be the same as a mind. That they just seem like obviously different things. And similarly, it seems like a number and a thought are obviously different things. This seems like about as obvious of an intuition as you could get, that thoughts and numbers are different, that while there are numbers between 1 and 3, there are not thoughts between 1 and 3. So I think the accounts of the other ones will get even stranger, where you try to explain the other abstract objects in terms of God.
I want to ask a follow-up based on something you just said, which is, you said that that like logic and math and like moral facts stand or fall together. I would want to say something weaker than that. I would want to say that realism in one area makes realism in the other areas more plausible.
Sorry, I wasn't suggesting that mathematical realism and moral realism stand and fall together. I was suggesting that you'd want to ground, if you think that they do that they do exist, you'd want to ground them in similar ways. So it would be weird to be a Platonist about math, but then to think that morality is grounded in God. I think you'd want to say either both math and morality are grounded in God, or neither are, or maybe you're a realist about one but not the other.
Okay, so that seems pretty reasonable to me. All right, shall we move on to the ontological argument? Actually, there are the two ontological arguments. There's the Anselm version, and I'm not sure whether there's a substantive difference between his and Descartes or whether they boil down to the same argument. And then you've got the modal ontological argument. Maybe we can talk about the modal ontological first, because I actually think it's easier to dispense with.
Sure. So the modal ontological argument, the idea is that God exists possibly, and then they say, if God exists possibly, then there are some possible worlds in which God exists. But God is the sort of being who, if he exists even in some possible worlds, he'd be necessary, because existing necessarily is a perfection. So if God exists in any possible worlds, he exists in all of them, and so then God exists necessarily. So this is the modal ontological argument. Now, okay, the problems for this is that there's no reason to think that God is possible if by possible you mean exist in some possible world, given that if there's a thing where if it is possible, then it's necessary, then asserting that it's possible just is asserting that it's necessary, right? So it sounds very modest. I say, oh, it's possible that God exists. But if by God you mean a being who, if he exists, is necessary, then that's just the same as asserting that he exists necessarily. If you assert that possibly Fermat's last theorem is false, that there are some possible worlds where it's false, given that it stands or falls across all the worlds, then you're just asserting that Fermat's last theorem is false. So this premise is just straightforwardly question begging. Now, there are certain things that people have said in defense of it. Those arguments, I wasn't grouping under the modal ontological argument that those are defensive of it, but I tend not to think they're any good. The other thing is there's a perfectly good parity, which is possibly God doesn't exist, and by the same reason that would establish that God doesn't exist. And it's hard to see what reason there is for thinking that possibly God does exist that wouldn't apply to thinking that possibly God does not exist. I also think that the modal ontological argument is vulnerable to various parities. So imagine a being that is the worst possible being. Well, this being is worse if it exists in all possible worlds. So if this being exists at all, it would exist necessarily. So you could argue this being has to exist necessarily. Similarly, imagine a world with every perfection except one. So maybe he knows every fact except the population of Italy. This being, it would be better if it exists than if it doesn't. So if it exists, it would exist necessarily because it has all the rest of the perfections. And so I think if you think that the ontological argument works, then you get a vast pantheon of gods, each missing one perfection, each missing two perfections, and so on.
Yeah, I think the same thing about the modal ontological argument. I've always thought that, okay, well, a couple of things seem to be going on here. One is I think we can have difficulty distinguishing between epistemic and metaphysical possibility. And the modal ontological argument requires metaphysical possibility. It's not like, oh, for all we know, there could be a God. That would just be a purely epistemic sense of possibility. But like, no, there is a possible world in which God exists. And I just don't see why anyone who doesn't think God exists in the actual world would be willing to concede that. I think if you ask most atheists, they'll think that atheism is necessarily true, i.e. there's no possible world in which atheism is false. I think they're all going to say that. So I just don't see why that's compelling at all. And so I would also put it in an F tier.
Right. I mean, you might think there's a possible world in which there's and probably most atheists will think this, in which there's a contingent God. So there's a possible world in which there's a being who is the greatest possible being and is limitless in power, knowledge, and goodness. But that doesn't entail that God actually exists. What you need is that God, the being that possibly exists, is one who, if he exists at all, exists necessarily. But then no atheist is going to think that a being who, if it exists at all, exists necessarily, exists in some possible worlds. Because then that being, that's just declaring the being to be necessary. It would be like saying to people who deny some, if there's a dispute about whether a mathematical theorem is true, you say, oh, do you accept that it's possibly true? Well, if it's possibly true, then it's actually true because it'll have the same status across all possible worlds. That's a very bad argument, and I think the modal ontological argument is equally bad.
I'm wondering how far you think the atheist could go in saying a godlike being could exist in some possible world, though. So, like, are you thinking like Zeus, or like a super powerful AI that takes over the whole universe in some distant possible world, or whatever, or
Well,
like an actual creator of a possible world, like a whole creator of one could exist in a different possible world? Because that seems pretty wild to me.
I don't know. It seems like an atheist could think that there's a being of limitless power, knowledge, and goodness who creates the world. I mean, so clearly, like, there will most likely be some greatest possible being. And so whichever being that being will possibly exist. But then there's no reason to think that that greatest possible being is such that if they exist, they do so necessarily.
Yeah, I see. I suppose there might be something weaker here that might still get you somewhere. So if the atheist could still be committed to saying that there is a something very close to God existing in some possible world, like not necessarily existing, just existing in some possible world. There's some possible world that has a creator of the universe and has all the moral perfections and stuff. Well, then, are you sure this isn't that world? If you admit that it's possible, I don't know. Maybe there's some force to that thought.
Most things are possible. There's a possible world with unicorns. There's a possible world with ghosts, but we shouldn't think that's the actual world. The reason we shouldn't think that's the actual world is just that, well, it has a low prior, and it does in fact match up with the evidence of our world. I think an atheist would say the same thing about God, even if God is possible.
I don't know, though. I mean, the evidence for there not being unicorns is like, well, we can just look around and we don't find any. I don't know that it's that easy to dismiss this possibility that you're talking about.
Right. Well, so I don't mean to suggest that the evidence for theism is like the evidence for unicorns. I don't think it is. I think the evidence for theism is very good, which is why I'm a theist. What I was saying is that in the atheist's eyes, this is no different from any of the infinite other things that are possible, but that they don't believe in, which they don't believe in it because of some combination of low priors plus poor fit with the evidence. And so I don't think this additional consideration, I mean, I guess certainly if the atheist thinks it's impossible, okay, then that's an even further problem for theism. But I guess I would think most atheists probably think that theism is possible. They just don't think it is in fact true.
I'd never considered that before. I mean, I don't know. I see your point about, look, you might think that there are all kinds of distant possible worlds that are just antecedently implausible, but I think just the possibility of a godlike being that at least would put some pressure on you to, like, okay, I do you know it's like inconsistent with the evidence? I don't know. I hadn't thought about it before, but
I mean, I think the atheist would give the same answer there as they would give to the other things that they don't believe in. A world where Julius Caesar didn't exist, clearly that's possible. So how do you know that's not the actual world? Well, the answer is that you look at the evidence in the actual world by considering the arguments for and against Caesar, and you conclude that it indicates that Caesar doesn't exist. In a similar way, you look at the evidence for and against the existence of God, and the atheist says, when you look at the evidence on both sides, it indicates that God doesn't exist. I don't see how it's overall different.
Okay. I'm not sure, but let's go to the original Anselmian argument, which I actually think is interesting. I think I would rate this one quite a bit higher than you rate it, but I would also probably not evaluate the arguments on exactly the same grounds as you've got here. So I think just in terms of its interestingness and originality, I would want to give it at least a C rating for that. And because it really is, like most of these arguments, you can find antecedents of them in earlier philosophers, like the cosmological arguments. You can find predecessors of those going back to the ancient Greeks and stuff. But this argument, it just seems like it was Anselm's invention. There's nothing like this before. It's interesting in that it is so counterintuitive and so completely a priori. And it is also interesting that it gets you all the way to the finish line. It's not just that you've got an unmoved mover or something, and then you've got to, do all these fancy gymnastics to get all of the other divine attributes. But if you really do have a greatest conceivable being, that really does seem like you ought to call it God. So if it can get to its conclusion, you for sure have God proven, which is interesting. So I don't think it's sound, but I do respect it in a kind of way, even though, it struck me as just being ridiculous when I first heard it, and I still sort of feel that way about it, but I do have a kind of respect for it. And also I want to say Anselm is pretty interesting as a philosopher. I like how in his work generally, like Thomas has read everything and cites everything, whereas not that Anselm hasn't done his reading of his predecessors, but you get the sense that he's just sort of thinking about his religion in this sort of fresh way, and he's not weighed down by all of these texts and all this tradition and trying to synthesize all this stuff. So there's something I enjoy about reading Anselm more than other, medieval theist philosophers. But okay, so tell me your take on this argument.
I certainly agree with you that the argument is interesting and thought-provoking, but I don't think that it's a good argument. The basic argument goes, God is the greatest conceivable being, but it's greater to exist than not to exist, and so God exists. Now, we have to be careful about the first premise, where it says God is the greatest conceivable being. There are at least three meanings of this that I can think of, and I think whichever one you go with, the argument turns out to be unconvincing. So one of them is, this means, if God exists, then he's the greatest conceivable being. But then the conclusion would just be, if God exists, he exists. Okay, this is not news to anyone. Another one is, you might say, there exists a God who is the greatest conceivable being. But then the first premise is clearly question-begging. If the first premise is, there exists a God who's the greatest conceivable being, no non-theist will accept it. And then the last way of doing it is you say, God, by definition, is the greatest conceivable being. But then that would only establish in the conclusion that God, by definition, exists. But the fact that God exists by definition doesn't tell us that God actually exists. The smallest actually existing Martian also exists by definition, but it doesn't actually exist. It just means that you've built into the definition that it exists. Now, the way Anselm does it is he does a third way, where he says that God exists at least in the mind. So he says that there are distinct kinds of existence in the mind and in reality. God exists in the mind and is the greatest conceivable being. And then as the greatest conceivable being, it's greater to exist in reality than just the mind. So God exists in reality. Now, so I think here you'll get a similar puzzle where when you say God is the greatest conceivable being in the mind, well, if you're referring to God's actual status, then that premise is just question begging, that God, however he exists, is the actual greatest conceivable being. Well, if God doesn't exist, then that's not true, right? So then that one's analogous to saying there exists a God who is the greatest conceivable being. Now, in contrast, if you say God is such that were he to exist, then he would be the greatest conceivable being. That God exists in the mind, and were he to exist, then he would be the greatest conceivable being. This doesn't mean that in reality he's the greatest conceivable being. But the argument, I think, just here's an analogous argument. Oh, Superman exists in the mind. Superman is very strong. But to be very strong, you have to exist, and so Superman exists. This is not convincing because it relies on equivocating between the properties that Superman is imagined to have that he has in the mind, and the ones and then whether those ones require an actual Superman to exist in reality. So I think the same thing of Anselm's argument. I also think Anselm's argument is vulnerable to various parodies. So imagine the worst conceivable being, it's worse if that being exists, so that being exists. Imagine a being with all the best properties, except for knowing the population of Italy. It's better for that being to exist. So you get this vast pantheon of different gods missing one or two of the virtues. So for that reason, I don't think that the argument is ultimately successful.
So I would, maybe it amounts to the same thing, but I would unpack Anselm's argument in a slightly different way. The way you stated it, it sounds more like Descartes' argument. So assume for reductio that God does not exist. Anselmian translation. So what you're saying is that God exists in the understanding alone, but not in reality. So he has this kind of way of thinking about, if you say something doesn't exist, you're saying that it exists. Something that has been thought of doesn't exist. You're saying it exists in the mind alone or in the imagination alone, but not in reality. Okay. So then you would be saying that the translation of that would be, okay, so you're saying that there is a greatest conceivable being that exists in the imagination alone, but does not exist in reality. But then you would be able to imagine an even greater being, and that being would be, it would exist in reality. Okay. And so you've started off assuming God does not exist, and then you end up contradicting yourself. So that seems crazy. Like, how could that possibly work? And I guess one kind of response to it, one response to it is to say, well, maybe if you ask the atheist, by God, do you mean a greatest conceivable being? I'm going to say that because it's less of a mouthful than to say a being greater than which cannot be conceived. The atheist presumably would say yes, but I think once you work this logic out, the atheist should say, okay, I guess I don't know what you mean by that. I guess I don't know what you mean by a greatest conceivable being. If that implies its existence, like believing that it actually exists, I guess I don't have that concept. The concept of a greatest conceivable being.
Well, yeah, I guess I would say that. So the idea is, if the atheist says, well, the greatest conceivable being doesn't exist, then there's a conceivable being who does exist who's even greater. Like, think back to the Superman case. So is Superman strong? The Superman that exists in the understanding. There's one sense in which Superman is strong, and Superman is imagined to be strong, and there's another sense in which Superman is not strong, in that there exists no Superman in reality who's in fact strong. So then the question is, are you talking about the one that exists in the imagination or the one that exists in reality? Well, if you're talking about the one that exists in the imagination, the one that exists in the imagination is imagined to exist. And that's all the argument establishes, that the God that you're imagining is imagined to exist. Okay, well, but that doesn't mean it actually exists. And if you're talking about the God in reality, then you would deny that the greatest conceivable being exists in the imagination, because then you're talking about its actual properties. And the one that exists in the imagination doesn't have any greatness, just like the Superman that exists in the imagination isn't strong. So I think whichever way you go, the argument just relies on sort of sliding back and forth between what's happening in the imagination or what's imagined to happen and what is happening in reality. So I think the argument is just almost uniquely unpersuasive.
What do you think of this idea of God as a greatest conceivable being? Like, the more I think about this, the more I think I'm not sure. Before we even specifically get to existence as a great making property, just do I even have the idea of a greatest conceivable being? I'm not sure that I do. Does that mean the greatest conceivable by me, or the greatest conceivable by any thinking creature? Or
I think generally the idea is it's the greatest possible being.
Greatest possible being.
Right. So the one, and if you think ideal conceivability and possibility line up, which I do, then it'll be the greatest being that anyone could ideally conceive of.
Well, so I guess I'm not sure that there is a univocal kind of greatness here, right? Like, greatness in what sense? Anselm has this idea. So, like, moral virtues are great making, having power is great making, existence is great making, or at least I think what he should say is existence is great making for a being that has, like, all and only or even mostly good properties. So, like, it wouldn't be great making for something that was terrible. Okay, now I'm not sure I really have this concept of greatness in mind. It seems like it's kind of I don't know, a philosophically gerrymandered concept of greatness that is meant to do some work here. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I actually have that concept of greatness. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think that I don't think greatness is a joint carving feature. I don't think that there is some like single property of greatness. Now, there was a while when I thought of God's central property as just being whatever set of properties are best to have, that those are the ones God has. And so then that explains why God's pretty simple, where, one of the fundamental things is goodness, and God just is what you get when you set the goodness score to infinity. I guess now I have a slightly different conception. I think probably God's essential property is being a limitless mind or a limitless agent, because if there's some higher order property that supervenes on lower order properties, which is true of how good a state of affairs is, how good a state of affairs is, like it'll depend on the other stuff that's going on in the state of affairs, then I don't think that the state of affairs, it can be simple just by instantiating some property. Right? So like, I think if there's a really, really complicated state of affairs, but it's maximally beautiful, I wouldn't say that's simple, because it's a complicated thing that it just instantiates a simple property. So for that reason, I don't think it's good to situate God's fundamental property as being limitless goodness. I prefer to situate it as being limitless, just a limitless mind or a limitless agent or something like that.
So, okay, I want to talk about the parodies of this. Here's a response I've never heard anyone give, but it has occurred to me as I've taught this over the years. This seems like a playable move. Okay. What about just biting the bullet on the parodies? Just embracing the cactus. Yeah, Garnilo's Lost Island really does exist. It's heaven, or it's one of the other worlds that God has created, or something like that. And the worst possible being, that exists too. It's the devil. Could we respond in that way and just say, yeah, the ontological argument proves all of that stuff, and that just makes it an even better argument?
Well, I don't think you'd want to think that the devil is the worst possible being,
because then he'd have to exist necessarily.
Right, he'd have to exist necessarily. He couldn't be independent, and in particular, then he'd be like unstoppable. Right, so it seems like the worst possible being would be one where it exists in like the worst way. So then it would be incompatible with there being an equally or more powerful God.
But maybe you could blunt that by having some kind of evil as privation view, where the evil being would necessarily be dependent on the good being. Maybe there'd be some way of blocking the positing of a devil that would be like logically incompatible with God.
Yeah, I don't find evil as a privation to be at all plausible. But if you have that view, maybe it helps a little bit. I guess it does seem weird that there's just this infinite pantheon of like slightly more powerful gods. I also think you'll also probably get like lots of things that are weird given theism. So consider the worst state of affairs for any possible being to be in. Well, it would be an infinitely terrible state of affairs. Well, it would be worse if that state of affairs existed. So then you just get this state of affairs, the worst state of affairs existing necessarily, and like God can't do anything about it. Like, I don't know. It just seems like a mess. You're opening Pandora's box.
Well, there's I know that's exactly what this response is. But there would only be one God. You wouldn't have an infinite pantheon. There'd only the greatest conceivable being would be God. But you could have a lot of archangels, and that are this ascending hierarchy of archangels that you can also prove by the ontological argument. I don't know. Maybe that it doesn't seem it's like in chess, if somebody has some really weird opening, you're like, how could that possibly work? But maybe it is playable by a grandmaster or something. Maybe somebody could make that work. But I've never heard anybody try to take that defense. The defense that I have heard, and I'd recommend Dan Bonavac's videos on YouTube about the ontological argument. They're pretty interesting. What he tries to do is he tries to say that it's implicit in Anselm's response to Garnilo that there is a difference between a greatest conceivable being and a greatest conceivable island. Like this connection between being and necessary existence doesn't hold if you add anything like to just being, So check it out. That's the other thing people have tried to do to diffuse the parody, is just try to say, well, this just doesn't work for anything but the greatest conceivable being.
I've heard people say that. I don't find it that plausible, because I think the same steps, like the steps in the ontological argument where you say, this thing exists in the mind, it's worse if it's better if it exists in reality, and so then it exists in reality. I don't see why it matters whether it's a being or an island or anything else. I also think the argument parodies will establish the second best conceivable being and the third best conceivable being, and so on.
Okay, let's see. Ascending up the chain a little bit to something a little bit less bad. There's the biological design argument from Irreducible Complexity, championed by Michael Bay. He actually did read his book on this a long time ago when I was in high school, and interested in defending this kind of argument for the existence of God. So let me just say briefly what I take the argument to be, although I haven't read it in a long time, and what I think is the objection to it that sinks it. So the argument is that if you look at life, there are systems such as the eye, I think, is one of them. Various, maybe some feature of the human immune system.
Yeah, he doesn't make the argument from the eye as much. He usually goes with blood clotting cascades and the bacterial flagellum.
Well, yeah, I guess I was confusing it with what some other creationists have said. But in any event, he says if you take any one part of these systems apart, the system just simply wouldn't work. And so you have to have all of these components together combined in a complex way, or they would confer no advantage whatsoever. And it's just seems really remote that all of these things would come together in a systematic way without some sort of design. And so there's a kind of an inference to the best explanation that a designer must be present. Is that, do you think, a fair presentation of the argument?
Yeah.
Okay, here's what I take the strongest objection to be, and I think it does indeed sink it, which is that even granting that these systems have irreducible complexity, what might have happened is there might have been like an evolutionary ancestor of these systems that had redundant systems in place, so it wasn't irreducibly complex. And then, since evolution often will eliminate redundancies for energy conservation and stuff, then you'll end up with something irreducibly complex. But it wasn't like all of those parts had to come together all at once. There could have been, some other system, the scaffolding of which sort of went away as evolution continued to develop the creature. And we wouldn't see that. Because we only see what exists now, right? So for any one of the irreducibly complex systems, they might have originated that way, and it's very hard to disprove that they didn't emerge that way. And I think that's a good objection to the argument.
Yeah, I agree. So I think, right, so this mechanism where you use old biological systems and then you sort of reuse them for more complicated features, for newer features, is called exaptation. And with the bacterial flagellum, for instance, there have been observed cases of the parts of the bacterial flagellum being used for other purposes. There are lots of other examples of this. So, for example, there's a part, the thing that forms mammals' ears is part of the jawbone of reptiles. And there have been transitional fossils that have had to be sort of bipart, have two different parts to it, where like part of it's in the ear and part of it's in the jaw. So, and then the idea is that like starts out in the ear and the jaw, and then you eliminate the bit in the jaw. And so then it just forms the ear bone. Right. So I think this is right. And just the gradual process of existing parts being morphed together, being repurposed, can obviously get you various new functions. And I don't know how you show in principle that even if you can't think of exactly how you would get to a procedure through stepwise evolution, I don't know how you, I think we should be sort of skeptical about our ability to guess the steps made by evolution over the course of millions of years. The other thing is that I think so I don't think the argument's that convincing, and I just think there's actively on the other side overwhelming evidence against it from the fact that evolution seems to much better explain these biological systems, right? So if God was intelligently designing many biological systems, you'd expect them to be designed a lot better and to work for achieving certain normative aims. The other thing is you observe this pattern in evolution known as nested hierarchies, where there are commonalities between mammals and reptiles, and commonalities between mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, and commonalities between mammals, reptiles, and amphibians and fish. And you just go all the way down the tree. So evolution, where you think of it as fully in charge, actively predicts that there would be nested hierarchies that go all the way down. In contrast, if God was sort of tinkering at some higher level, then you would expect there to be lots of sort of higher level features that mysteriously show up at the level of mammals and fish, but that don't show up at the deeper level. It's weird that it only shows up at that divine intervention only shows up at the very, very deep level. So that it looks like it's surprising that it forms the nested hierarchy pattern rather than God having more direct intervention. And then you also get the problem of just there are lots of poor divine designs where if God is like making things, it's weird that he doesn't make them better. So for that reason, I just think the proposal is like very, very implausible.
Well, I mean, I don't know about that point about God would have optimized his creations. I mean, not necessarily. Maybe, he doesn't want to spoil us. Maybe he wants us to recognize our dependence on him in some way by not giving us perfect bodies.
It's surprising that the things are imperfect in very similar ways to the ways you would expect them to exist on evolution. So it happens to be that the imperfect processes that exist happen to be ones that serve evolutionary functions that are very efficient at passing on our genes, but seem to bring about very bad things.
Well, I'm not imagining that this kind of creationist would completely reject that evolution is happening. All you would need is some divine intervention at one point in the causal chain, and then evolution can take things forward, and he can sort of let the system go. I do think there's room for a consistent view, at least a consistent view, where you've got a kind of I guess fine tuning at the biological level that is then sort of allowed to run its course without concern for optimization. I think that's at least a consistent view you could have.
But if you have God sort of interfering in various levels of the evolutionary process, it's suspicious that the thing that God is doing look very much like the processes that you would expect to evolve naturally. So God could have equipped us with all sorts of faculties that are really, really valuable and also enhance our survival. It's weird that the ways that he's like monkeying with the system is by designing an efficient bacterial flagella that allows bacteria to infect us more effectively. Like you could imagine God making the following, making a series of mutations where you need 10 at once, but it makes it so that we never get cancer. That would be much more expected. What's surprising is that he does the particular pattern of sort of selections where they're the sorts of things that can be explained pretty well by the evolutionary process. Like I would expect it to be a whole lot clearer if God were really sort of interfering with the evolutionary process.
Do you think there are any kind of organisms that we could discover either on Earth or some other planet that would make this design argument more powerful? If we went to, I don't know, Neptune or something, or one of the, it wouldn't be Neptune. We went to Titan on Saturn's moon Titan, and they're like creatures that have wheels instead of legs to move around, and have all these systems that like we see no way how any evolutionary path that we know of could have led to that. I mean, we might think, okay, maybe that there's a lot more about evolution we need to know. Maybe these beings were indeed intelligently designed by creatures like us who are just really good at genetic engineering and stuff. It's hard to see what we might discover in biology that would force us to posit God as a creator.
Right. So you could have us discover something like this. So imagine we discovered some organism where we looked at the difference between different organisms in the fossil record. And we figured out that there were a series of mutations that were all super beneficial, that you had to have lots of them at once, and that made it so that they didn't get cancer. But that they sort of like, there were too many too fast, right? So you would have to have, 10 at once for any of them to be beneficial. If there were really cases like that, or cases where there was convincing evidence of irreducible complexity, then I think that could be pretty convincing. Like if there was just some completely new appendage that was very complicated and there were no precursors that showed up in the fossil record, and it was like, it didn't like have disjointed parts to it. It was just one sort of non-differentiated bit. So that, it didn't divide up into different parts. You could also get evidence for it if you saw exception to the pattern of nested hierarchies, then that would give you evidence against evolution, at least being the thing that's fully guiding the show.
All right, next, what do we have? Oh, you really don't like the argument for motion, huh?
No.
Okay. Tell us why not.
So I think there are different versions of the arguments for motion, and some of them maybe are not terrible. So like there's a version of the argument for motion where it's just sort of like the Kalam, where it's just like, look, change itself originates from some other change. And so by regress, you need something that changes other stuff without itself being changed. And then you argue, God's a good candidate for that. Okay, fine. That argument I think is not crazy. I don't find it that convincing, but I think it's sort of like the Kalam. The argument for motion, generally they'll say, change, motion is the actualization of potential. So it's when a thing goes from a way it can be to a way it is. And then they say that by regress, this means that there's some unmoved mover, and then there has to be pure actuality. So pure like changingness, and then they'll try to squeeze the divine attributes from this. I don't find any of this persuasive. I don't agree with the account of change. I don't think there's anything that rules out an infinite regress of changers. I don't think that there's anything that rules out thinking that there are changes that originate without some previous changer. I don't think, even if the argument gets you to some unmoved mover, I don't think it gets you to some unmovable mover. I don't think it gets you to a being that's pure actuality. I don't think that a being that's pure actuality is even coherent. I don't think there are any convincing reasons to think that it's God. I get off the boat at almost every step. And at some of the steps, I think they're just clear, like, errors of inference. So the regress argument just gets you to an unmoved mover. And then when they say, well, it must be something with no potential to move. Well, that doesn't follow. That it does not, in fact, move doesn't imply that it has no potential to move.
We've already talked about the Neoplatonic one. Let's talk about the Kalam and miracles. The Kalam is the only argument for the existence of God I've got a paper on. I've got one in Res Philosophica, responding to Wes Morriston at CU Boulder. So the Kalam, as I understand it, what's distinctive about it is the premise that says anything that has a beginning has a cause for its existence. And the second premise is that the universe had a beginning and so forth. So the universe must have a cause for its existence. And then there's an inference to the best explanation that says that, that must be God. The cause of the universe must be God.
Yeah.
Now, I think probably the weakest step in this argument is that last inference. If the universe had a beginning, it might be something that's just completely inconceivable to us. William Lane Craig strives mightily to show that it would have to be something that would be an agent. And I just don't find it very persuasive. So I think the argument is unsuccessful for at least that reason. I also don't think that we can be that sure that the universe had a beginning. There are two different ways of trying to show this, an a priori one and an empirical one. So the a priori one is to think that also, just to take all of the paradoxes of the actual infinite and try to show, okay, there could not have been a an infinite series of events like regressing into the past, because then you could have an angel that's like 3, 2, 1, 0. Ah, done. I just counted down from infinity. Okay, you're supposed to be struck with the intuition that that's impossible, even if the angel has always been infinitely counting. So like, why is it now that the time that it is, and not like 500 years ago or 500 years in the future or something? I don't know that I find that persuasive, these kinds of considerations. Nor do I find the empirical arguments all that persuasive. So the appeal to like, well, the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe. I think we just don't know that. I do, however, have some things to say in defense of the premise that everything that has a beginning has a cause for its existence. I don't see like a lot of philosophers like Wes Morriston and Graham Oppy want to make this move to say that that maybe that's true of things in the universe. We can tell like we can think that, okay, like this cup had a beginning, it must have a cause to its existence, but they want to say, but we can't infer from that to the universe as a whole. And I try to challenge that criticism in that paper, but nonetheless, I think that it fails for at least those two reasons, to actually establish God's existence.
Yeah. The way I feel about the Kalam, I think that it's not very persuasive because there are several different steps and they're each controversial. So as far as I can tell, and these are not explicitly the premises, but there are sort of 4 things that you have to think to be on board with the Kalam. First, you have to think that if a thing begins to exist in time, it must have a cause. Second, you have to think that the universe began to exist. Or more precisely, that the universe, it doesn't go infinitely far back into the past. Third, you have to think that that B theory is false. So what B theorists say is that every moment of time is equally real. So what we think of as before and after is just like earlier and later than spatial relations. If the B theory is true, then there's nothing that mysterious about the universe existing. Just like there's nothing mysterious about an object having first point in space where it exists, there's nothing that mysterious about an object having a first point in time where it exists. So the block universe just existing timelessly is perfectly fine on B theory. And then lastly is that if there is a cause of the universe, it's God. And I'm not at all confident in any of these steps. So first, with the step that things that begin to exist have to have causes, I don't think that's right. I think in general you should look for causes of anything. But the theist will think there's something that's uncaused, which is God. The atheist will think that there's something that's uncaused. I don't think that there's anything less mysterious about a thing that's uncaused that's outside of time than a thing that's uncaused that's within time. So when Craig is defending this premise, he'll often say, oh, it's so silly thinking that, if universes can pop into being out of nothing, why not Beethoven and root beer? But it would be equally mysterious for Beethoven and root beer to simply exist atemporally. So for that reason, I'm not that sold on this premise. I think both the atheist and the theist will have to think that there's something that's uncaused. And I don't see why thinking it's in time is any worse than thinking that it's outside of time. Regarding now, they'll defend this by saying that if you drop this principle, then it's mysterious why things don't always pop into existence. But I think if you buy my view that basically like simplicity is a virtue in that you should limit the number of fundamental entities that there are, then it's very unlikely that Beethoven will pop into being, because that would be a new fundamental entity. It would be a very complicated fundamental entity, and it would be much less sort of elegant. So it's not just simplicity, but there's a virtue of elegance. And Beethoven just appearing for no reason would compromise elegance. So I'm not confident in that step. In the third step about whether there's a past infinite, I tend not to think that there are convincing arguments for a past infinite. The empirical arguments, I don't know the physics. I've heard sort of different things from physicists. I think maybe there's some apparently technical theorems to show that there are certain constraints on an infinite past, but I don't think there is anything like a conclusive proof. And I don't think the philosophical arguments are convincing. I think they might be right, but I'm not so sure. I definitely think an actual infinite is possible, but I'm not as sold on infinite causal chains And then lastly, I think if there's some cause of the universe, I don't see what's wrong with just thinking that the cause of the universe is like some set of laws that give rise to other stuff. Generally, Craig defines the universe as time, space, and matter. So I don't see what's wrong with saying that there's some sort of simple form of material stuff that gives rise to time and space, where like there's some weird fields with some properties that of the things that physicists talk about. So I think the argument, it's not very persuasive because there are just enough different steps and they all have to be right for the argument to be right. And I'm not that sure that any of them is right. That if there are 4 controversial steps and you give each of them a 50% probability, then the odds that they're all right is 1 in 16, which seems roughly right with how likely the argument is to succeed.
I'm not sure I follow that first point about, well, it would be just as mysterious for Beethoven and root beer to exist atemporally, sure, but it's not like abstract entities. If they exist, would have to be atemporally. I would think. So, is it the issue is with concrete entities existing, or I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah. So with abstract objects, I've never found there to be anything that mysterious about abstract objects existing. Like people say, oh, it's very complicated.
Me neither.
That the number 2 exists. And it's like, it seems more mysterious for the number 2 not to exist. So I guess it's sort of concrete things that are causally efficacious, contingent things, where it seems very mysterious for the thing to be caused. Like it seems like really the principle is that if you see a thing, in general, there should be a strong presumption with thinking that it has a cause of some sort or another. But I mean, both theists and atheists will leave something unexplained. Or sorry, I don't think all things you should look for. Like I don't think we need a cause of abstract object. So if you have a concrete thing, you should look for a cause of it. But both the theists and the atheists will have a concrete thing that's unexplained. So I don't think grouping it with So I don't think that theism has much of an advantage here.
Unexplained, but comes to being in time, I guess.
Yeah, but it seems equally mysterious if it's unexplained and is timeless as if it's unexplained and in time. Like the thing that rules out Beethoven popping into being 5 seconds from now just seems to be that Beethoven existing uncaused is really unlikely, because it would be equally mysterious if Beethoven just existed atemporally.
Okay, but the universe coming into existence uncaused seems kind of unlikely too.
I don't.
If it really did come into existence at any point, I'm not sure that it did.
When we talk about it coming into existence, I think that's a bit misleading of a phrasing. What we imagine when we talk about coming into existence is that sort of like there was a state of nothing for a while and poof, a universe appeared. That would be really weird. But the idea is not that there was nothing that was sitting around for a while before the universe and then pop and the universe appeared. Instead, the idea is just pre-universe, just there wasn't anything. It's not that there was a state where nothing was in it. It's that there was no state prior to the universe. It's not the case that there was any state that existed pre-universe. So it's just like, there's a first moment of time. There's nothing before that. And so there's no, there's no appearing out of nothing. It's just there's nothing of which it appeared out of.
Right. I don't see that helps, though. Like if I ask, what is the cause of this phone? It came into existence. Why did it come into existence? Then you get all the way back to the Big Bang. And that now a lot of like Oppie says, oh, well, you can't assume that the first moment is like all of the other moments. And it's like that seems like an arbitrary restriction on induction. Like, why would I not assume that? Anyway, I've not found these sort of moves all that persuasive, but I think the argument is unsound anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Miracles. Why don't you tell us what you think about miracles?
Okay, so miracles I put in C tier, where I think miracles are maybe some evidence for theism. And it'll depend on the total evidence regarding theism. So on the one hand, I think the pattern of miracles is both weird on theism and on naturalism. So on theism, it's weird because you'd expect there to be probably more miracles. And on naturalism, the number of well-attested miracles is strange. one miracle that's decently well tested is the miracle at Zaytun, where there were lights that looked like the Virgin Mary that repeatedly appeared atop a Coptic church for several years. It was seen by thousands of people. It was photographed. All the light in the city was turned off. The lights kept appearing. The Egyptian government thoroughly investigated. They never turned up any naturalistic explanation of this. And so I think it's at least sort of mysterious that there are these things like this on naturalism. There was another case of a monk named Joseph of Cupertino. Well, sorry, named Joseph, who was of Cupertino, who there are just many thousands of eyewitnesses of him repeatedly flying. And there's a healing miracle called the miracle at Calanda. If you're interested, Jimmy Aiken has a video on this that was pretty good, that went through the facts and described sort of what's surprising about this miracle. So I think these miracles are like surprisingly well attested, and they are sort of they're like one thing that fits a little bit better on a theistic worldview than naturalism. The naturalists can explain them away, but I think the things are sufficiently improbable that they're pretty unexpected on naturalism. It's pretty surprising on naturalism that you just consistently get like many millions of people attesting to something that never happened. So like, take the case of Joseph of Cupertino, for example. Okay, you have many thousands of people saying they saw him flying constantly, often giving very similar reports about the precise manner in which he was flying. And Joseph kept getting like persecuted for flying. So he kept getting fired from his jobs because they said he was flying during Mass and it was distracting. He almost got investigated by the Inquisition for this, or he got investigated, but it was pretty dicey. So it doesn't seem like it was good for him. So, okay, what's the explanation of this? Well, one explanation is that people didn't in fact say he was flying. But okay, that's clearly ridiculous. We have, thousands of accounts of him flying. The other account is they said he was flying, but they were lying, which is clearly ridiculous. Why would these thousands of people lie with no incentive? Why would he lie? It doesn't make any sense. And so if people said it and they weren't lying, then the only options are they're mistaken or telling the truth. Well, okay, are they mistaken? Well, okay, think about you. Like, we could tend to imagine people in the ancient world just being really stupid. So we imagine them being mistaken about super obvious things. But just imagine you being mistaken about this. So imagine you thinking a guy flew, thinking you saw a guy flew in broad daylight when he didn't, and describing this in great detail. That doesn't seem so plausible. And you look at the naturalistic explanations, and they're like, oh, maybe he was jumping and people got confused. Oh, yeah, that's very plausible. The guy was jumping, and then they thought he was flying because they were brained. Come on, this isn't very believable. So I think this is one fact that theism has a better explanation of than naturalism. But the pattern of miracles is sort of weird. It's pretty inconsistent. It's such that I wouldn't put all my eggs in this basket. The miracles that religious people tend to care a lot about are like the resurrection, the alleged miracle of the Quran, the golden plate stuff. I don't think any of these are that well tested. Now, they get higher priors because the probability of one of the religions being right is not that low. So, okay, maybe there's going to be some evidence for it. But yeah, I ultimately don't think that you should put too many eggs in this basket. I just think it's one of these things that makes a little bit better sense once you're a theist than once you're a naturalist. It's one more thing about the world that you're like, okay, this now sort of fits into my worldview, but I don't think it's decisive.
Yeah, so I have seen Cameron Bertuzzi, is that his last name?
Yeah.
Posting a lot of stuff about the Zaytun and some of the online arguments about that. And I haven't gone into the weeds about this. Actually, I was in the town of Zaytun once, about 10 years ago, a little more than that. I don't think I knew about this. It was something that had occurred there. But I think Zaytun just means olives in Arabic. Anyway, I've looked at the photos. I've had this thought, maybe there's an answer to this, but it's specifically described as sightings of Mary. And it's like, how would anybody know? Nobody alive knows exactly what Mary looks like. I mean, why not just say it's an angelic figure? Like, how would you know that it was Mary? And maybe they're not claiming to know. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think that once you think it's an angelic figure that was atop a church that was dedicated specifically to Mary and continually reappeared, and that I think there were people who, like, there were some healings from it. Yeah, maybe it's some angel, but okay, it's a reasonable guess that it's Mary, and even if it's some angel or another, that's also a miracle.
So yeah, that's right. So I guess
Anyway, but I was on Team Zaytoon long before Cameron was.
okay.
I
So
was mentioning
sorry.
this years ago.
Sorry,
I was on
happened to be seeing it for.
I was on
recently.
I was on Team Zaytoon before it was cool.
Okay. Okay. So I guess I don't know. I mean, I've heard Richard Dawkins say, no matter what evidence you have for a miracle, you should always assume that there is a naturalistic explanation. Like if you see the statue of the Virgin Mary wave to you, you should think, oh well, there's like a tiny chance that all of the molecules in the statue vibrated in just a way to create that. It's like it's astronomically tiny, but like who knows, or infinitesimal, but you should always assume a naturalistic explanation. Now that just sounds dogmatic to me. That just sounds insane. Surely there's some point at which it's more reasonable to think that you've witnessed a miracle. So when is that? That's very hard to say. That's very hard to say. If I saw an angelic figure on a church that looked like the Virgin Mary, I don't know. I mean, I might just think I don't know what's going on. Not sure what I would think. If I saw somebody levitating in front of me, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. And also the levitation and stuff, it might be evidence for theism, but it might just be evidence for like some other kind of supernatural thing, like
Right. I think it's evidence for the supernatural, and then once you believe in the supernatural, it'll be evidence for theism. Regarding the levitations, if you end up concluding that there actually were levitations, I mean, you might think it's a little bit more likely because it occurred in a religious setting, and maybe God sort of cares about those. But yeah, I take the point that I don't think it gets you. It doesn't get you that near to theism.
And I also wonder, what would people think of, like, suppose there were a powerful miracle, or like a well-attested supposed miracle for a religion you rejected, right? Hinduism or Buddhism, or I don't know.
Yeah.
Would you think? Okay, I'm really going to take this religion seriously now.
This is actually why I'm not. So I'm not a Christian, but I'm a generic theist. Even though I accept that there are probably some pretty well evidenced Christian miracles. So I think that the Zaytoon one's pretty good. I think the Joseph of Cupertino one's pretty good. There are some Christian healing miracles. But I also think there are some non-Christian miracles that are pretty good. And there's a selection effect where the Christian ones tend to get better documented. Like there are some ones Dale Allison talked about involved in the rainbow body phenomenon. And I would sort of expect God to be a pluralist and do lots of different kinds of miracles. It would seem sort of wicked to just pick a favorite group and then only do miracles for those guys and not for anyone else. I think God, even if I were a Christian, I would expect God to do miracles in lots of settings. So maybe more in a Christian setting. So maybe I think modern miracles are slight evidence for Christianity. But yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with a Christian saying, yeah, sometimes God does miracles to help out Muslims.
Yeah, but the other thing is just, wouldn't you expect miracles to happen in a really systematic way? For example, the resurrection or something like that. That is pivotal to Christianity. It has a very clear place in the Christian narrative. Okay, I can understand why that would happen, assuming Christianity is true. It would have to happen, but all of these other ones, it's just sort of like, why this particular monk? It just seems so kind of random. You don't see, I don't know why. And why is it that this point has been made about Zaytoon? Why is it that these sorts of things happen when Egypt is going some kind of national, I don't know, trauma or something like that, or difficult time? I think the Zaytoon thing happened with, like, is it in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, which they lost, or something like that?
Yeah, let me see when it was. Yeah, so it was between 1968. It was about 3 years starting on 1968. Wait, I thought the Yom Kippur War
73.
was 1973. Yeah, but it was after they lost the 67 war. But I think there are lots of like I didn't find this one to be that impressive. I think there are lots of times you could point to when like you could always point to some event that's happening and say, oh, they were dispirited, so they wanted a miracle. But I agree, it's puzzling the particular pattern of miracles that happen. I do think that this, like, I think probably most miracles, the best guess. I mean, there are some that are carried out where it seems more likely that they're from God, where just like a healing miracle. And there are some of those that are maybe decently well attested. With like the levitation miracles, for example, I think there you should probably think maybe it's like angels or like demons who are doing that. And if you already think you want to believe in those to solve the problem of evil, because then you get to convert natural evil to moral evil, then it becomes possible that they would sort of intervene in kind of weird ways.
Yeah, that might be right. Yeah. So if you have demons in the picture, then you can also explain away the other religions' miracles.
I agree. The miracles that we observe in the world is really weird on both theism and naturalism. And so I think overall it's evidence for theism, but it's certainly strange that it's not more systematic.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with you. So I guess the C rating does seem good. This one does seem a little bit better than some of the other arguments we've been talking about, though still not super persuasive. So anything else you have to add either on this or anything else?
No.
All right. I think with that argument, then I think we will wrap this one up. So thanks very much, Matthew, for coming on Micro-Digressions, and looking forward to continuing this with the better arguments for the existence of God.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And if people want to read more about my assessment of these arguments in more detail, I have my most popular article that you can find if you go to my blog, Bentham's newsletter, and go to the top, is just the tier list of arguments for God. The article ended up blowing up because Ross Douthat linked to it in the New York Times, and so huge numbers of people ended up seeing. So yeah, that's if you want to read more. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Spencer. Nice chatting about these things.